In 35 years, this heir to a Viennese publishing house will personally order the execution of 8,000 people. But in 1908, his birth is merely the arrival of another bourgeois son in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Amon Leopold Göth enters a world of privilege. His father owns a prosperous publishing business. The family occupies a respectable position in the heart of Vienna. Inside their home, the heir carries the sharp scent of fresh printer's ink and the weight of expensive paper. 6-year-old Amon stands by a tall window. He watches the street. The Great War has begun. The empire begins to fracture. 1918 brings the collapse. After the Treaty of Versailles, Austria loses 7/8 of its territory. The multi-ethnic giant is dismembered. What remained was a fragment, a small German republic. Most Austrians viewed this new state as artificial and unviable. Poverty replaced imperial grandeur. Hunger moved into the city. Veterans returned to a country that no longer existed. This humiliation triggered a massive radicalization of the youth. In the ruins of the monarchy, resentment became the primary political currency of post-war Austria. In 1931, the 23-year-old heir to a publishing empire made a definitive political choice. The collapse of the monarchy had bred a generation of radicals. Göth was their vanguard. He joined the Nazi Party when membership was a criminal offense against the Austrian state. What drove a son of wealthy parents into the criminal underground? A hunger for physical violence. For Göth, ideology was merely a scaffold for his impulses. In 1932, he entered the Schutzstaffel. The SS in Austria was not a government branch. It was a banned paramilitary insurgency. At the time, Austrian law punished SS membership with heavy prison sentences. Göth ignored the risk. He moved through the shadows of Vienna, coordinating secret cells and organizing acts of sabotage. He was not a bystander or a victim of social pressure. He was an active insurgent. The contrast was absolute. By day, he maintained the facade of a respectable bourgeois from the publishing world. By night, he orchestrated political violence in the streets. As the Austrian authorities launched a crackdown on local Nazis, the risk of arrest became a certainty. Göth abandoned his life in Vienna and fled across the border to Germany. Germany offered a sanctuary for the radicalized. While the Austrian authorities hunted local Nazis, the neighboring regime had already solidified its grip on power. Heinrich Himmler was transforming the SS. What began as a personal guard for the Führer became a sprawling apparatus of state terror. For a man like Göth, this was not just a political movement. It was the ultimate career ladder for a sociopath. The SS expanded with calculated precision. It needed executives, not just theorists. Göth fit the profile. He exchanged his civilian life for the rigid texture of the black wool SS uniform. In March of 1938, the Anschluss brought the German war machine into Austria. Göth returned to Vienna as a victor. To the neighbors, he appeared respectable. He married for the second time and settled into a middle-class routine. It was a carefully constructed facade. Behind the domestic veneer, Göth rose through the hierarchy by demonstrating cold, unwavering efficiency. He did not care for racial philosophy or intellectual debates. He focused on results. By 1942, his superiors recognized a man willing to perform the most brutal tasks without hesitation. Göth was ready for his next assignment. The efficiency of the Viennese careerist did not go unnoticed. In 1942, the SS High Command transferred Göth to occupied Poland. He reported to the headquarters of Operation Reinhard in Lublin. A single document sat on the desk. Göth read the official appointment to the staff of SS Brigadeführer Odilo Globoknik. Behind the bureaucratic codename Reinhard lay the mechanics of total annihilation. The objective was the systematic liquidation of over 2 million Jews in the general government. The infrastructure of death was already operational. Göth studied the map of eastern Poland. 3 primary points marked the landscape: Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. These locations were not designed for labor or incarceration. They were industrial slaughterhouses. The scale was unprecedented. According to SS reports, Operation Reinhard resulted in the methodical murder of more than 1.7 million Polish Jews. Night and day, the logistics of genocide moved across the rails. Heavy steel wagons screeched against the platforms. The metallic clang of the doors echoed through the pine forests. For the architects in Lublin, these were not people. They were units of cargo to be processed. Göth observed the machinery of the death factories. He learned how to manage the flow of victims. He mastered the transition from transport to gas chamber. His superiors required a man who could balance ledger books with mass executions. In February 1943, the apprenticeship in Lublin ended. The system demanded a new administrator for a rising facility near Krakow. Göth packed his gear for the final move. He became the third SS officer assigned to the camp. In February 1943, the career of the Viennese officer reached a new peak. The site for his ambition was a suburb of Krakow called Płaszów. Here, the SS did not just build a camp. They staged a desecration. The foundation rested on 2 Jewish cemeteries. Heavy machinery moved in. The sound of marble headstones cracking under steel treads filled the air. Thousands of graves were uprooted. The bones of generations were scattered to make room for barracks and wire. This was not a tactical choice. It was an ideological statement. A deceptive sign at the entrance read, "Labor Camp." It was a calculated lie. Everyone behind the wire understood the reality of the limestone quarry. When Göth took command on February 11th, he inherited a population of 2,000 prisoners. The facility was fresh, raw, and expanding. At that moment, it functioned as a standard node in the Nazi slave labor network. 8,000 lives ended by one man's signature. This was not the work of a firing squad or a gas chamber. It was the personal tally of Amon Göth. By February 1943, the arrival of 2,000 prisoners transformed Płaszów. It was no longer a labor site. It became a private hunting ground. The morning fog clings to the villa balcony. Göth steps outside. He leans against the railing. He grips the cold steel of a precision rifle. Through the telescopic sight, he scans the camp for a target. A slow movement, a bowed head, a momentary pause in labor. He exhales. One shot, one death. Was this military necessity? No. It was marksmanship practice. Göth rejected the dry bureaucracy of the SS. He preferred the visceral. He hung victims from meat hooks. He watched them for weeks as they rotted alive. He trained dogs to tear human flesh on command. During the liquidation of 3 Jewish ghettos, he stepped into the mud himself. He executed dozens of women and children with a pistol at point-blank range. 8,000 murders. This is the population of an entire European municipality, erased by the whims of a single commander. He turned terror into a domestic routine. But the violence became too chaotic even for the Reich. In 1944, the SS police arrested Göth for his uncontrolled brutality. The 8,000 lives Göth extinguished personally were part of a larger, darker machinery. Over 18 months, 150,000 people passed through the gates of Płaszów. Most commanders delegated the killing. They watched from a distance. Göth chose the opposite. He demanded to be the center of the terror. He stood over 2 meters tall, a massive, imposing silhouette. When he moved, the wooden floors groaned under his weight. Prisoners froze at the sound of his heavy, rhythmic footsteps. How did a low-ranking officer seize power that bypassed every legal tribunal? He simply usurped the right to exist. Göth needed to see the pupils dilate in fear. He needed to hear the specific pitch of a plea before he broke it. For him, violence was not a duty, it was a sensory requirement. He would tower over a kneeling prisoner, staring into their eyes for a long, silent minute. Then, he would deliver a sentence that required no judge. The scale of this transit hub was staggering. 150,000 victims. That is more than the entire population of Salzburg at the time. At its absolute peak, the camp held 25,000 prisoners simultaneously. Heinrich Himmler designed the industrial infrastructure of genocide from an office in Berlin. He created a hierarchy of death with specialized roles. The system aimed for cold, bureaucratic efficiency. It sought to distance the executioner from the victim through paperwork and distance. Amon Göth chose a different path. He transformed the directives of the state into a personal theater of sadism. Płaszów served as his stage. While the SS supervised the transit of 150,000 people toward Auschwitz, Göth focused on the individual. He dismantled the psychological barriers intended by his superiors. For him, the systematic destruction of the body was secondary to the breaking of the spirit. The camp functioned as a machine, but the commandant acted as its erratic soul. He operated beyond the standard military discipline of the Reich. He sought to humiliate and torture before the final blow. Thousands of prisoners woke each morning in a state of total uncertainty. No one knew if they would survive to see the sunset. This absolute power over life and death materialized every morning as a routine ritual on the villa's balcony. Amon Göth stepped out into the cold air. Below him lay the assembly square of Płaszów. Thousands of skeletal figures in striped uniforms moved between the barracks. They prepared for the mandatory roll call. Göth did not look at the sunrise. He looked for targets. He handled his weapons with the meticulous care of a professional athlete. He cleaned the barrels. He checked the bolts. Göth kept a collection of high-precision rifles and pistols in his residence, always ready for use. The commandant stood on his elevated vantage point. He observed the slow movement of the prisoners. One man stumbled while carrying supplies. Another struggled to keep pace in the formation. Göth raised the rifle. He aimed with deliberate, cold calm. The sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning silence. It echoed across the frozen assembly square. A prisoner collapsed. Sometimes the bullet killed instantly. Often, the wounded merely writhed on the dirt, bleeding and agonizing in the light of dawn. The formation remained motionless. The system dictated a singular, absolute rule for those standing in line. Prisoners were prohibited under penalty of death from providing any aid to the fallen. Joseph Bau, prisoner number 69,084. For him and thousands of others, the balcony of the commandant's villa was not an architectural detail. It was a sniper's nest. The line of sight from that balcony dictated the survival of the masses. Bau described a psychological landscape where the primary state of existence was the constant chattering of teeth. This was not mere execution, it was the systematic cultivation of terror. According to medical observations of camp survivors, the stress levels of those living within Göth's direct view mirrored the severe shell shock found in frontline combat soldiers. The unpredictability shattered the human psyche. Moving too fast meant death. Standing still was no guarantee of safety. Amon Göth viewed these thousands of lives as simple ballistic variables. He practiced his aim with the regularity of a morning hobbyist. He remained a repugnant anomaly, a commander who replaced military discipline with the whims of a predator. He refined his techniques of torture and sent his victims straight to hell. If prisoner 69,084 watched the terror from a distance, the camp's dog caretaker lived in the center of a different, more intimate nightmare. Amon Göth's villa housed two Great Danes named Ralph and Rolf. These animals belonged to a breed once used for hunting wild boars. In Płaszów, their instincts underwent a systematic reprogramming. They were no longer pets. They were industrial tools of biological violence. The process was mechanical. Göth issued a short, sharp command. The massive dogs lunged. They ignored the throat and went for the soft tissue. Ralph and Rolf tore through muscle and shattered bone, while Göth stood motionless. He watched the blood soak into the Polish soil. A low, guttural growl preceded every attack. The dogs did not bark, they hunted. Did the animals retain any fragment of their original nature? In the kennel, a Jewish prisoner served as their caretaker. He fed them. He spoke to them. Under his hands, the killers became dogs again. The contrast was absolute. To Göth, the animals were extensions of his own psychopathy. To the caretaker, they were living beings capable of affection. The Great Danes began to prefer the prisoner's presence to their masters. They wagged their tails when the Jew approached. Göth observed this shift with a cold, narcissistic fury. He could not tolerate a hierarchy where a subhuman held more influence than the commandant. The dogs had committed a fatal error. They recognized a human being. Göth ordered the immediate execution of the caretaker. Death from the hounds was merely one option for the condemned. For daily control, Göth relied on the physiological and mental destruction of the whip. This was the ritual of Janti Ba. The commandant never delegated this specific form of violence. He sought the sensory feedback of the strike. The wet whistle of the whip sliced the air before tearing into human skin. Göth watched the transformation of the face. Cheeks swelled, skin turned a deep, bruised blue. Teeth shattered against the gravel of the roll call square. Did the victim remain a person during the agony? Göth ensured they did not. The prisoner had to participate in their own breaking. They were forced to shout the number of each lash. Every strike required a loud, clear count in German. The goal was the total collapse of dignity through forced collaboration. If the prisoner lost focus from the pain, the tally stopped. If the voice cracked or the number was wrong, the process reset. The count returned to zero. Any sense of solidarity in Płaszów was systematically dismantled. Amon Göth transformed the camp into a laboratory for ancient, ritualized cruelty. In the command building, prisoners in the hallways stood paralyzed. They listened to the muffled screams coming through the heavy office doors. A metal hook was bolted into the ceiling of Göth's private office. During interrogations, the accused were bound by their ankles and hoisted upward. They hung upside down, spinning slowly in the center of the room. The hook groaned under the shifting weight of a human body. Then, Göth gave the signal. He released his Great Danes. The animals leaped at the suspended, helpless victims, tearing at their faces and shoulders. What was the logic behind executing the innocent? Total psychological collapse. Göth wanted every prisoner to know that their survival did not depend on their own actions. He resurrected decimation. It was a punishment used by Roman legions for cowardice, but Göth applied it to starving civilians. When one prisoner escaped, the entire work group was lined up in the yard. Göth walked slowly along the shivering row. His boots crunched on the gravel as he pointed his finger, counting. 1, 2, 3. Every 10th man was stepped forward. They were executed on the spot, usually with a single shot to the neck. The victims had no connection to the escape and no knowledge of the plan. By August 1943, the thin veneer of disciplinary logic in Płaszów had vanished. If the previous decimation followed a crude retaliatory script for the escape, Göth now abandoned motives entirely. He sought a total collapse of cause and effect. The mourning formation became a lottery of sudden death. During one assembly, Göth scanned the rows of emaciated figures. His eyes stopped on a man who stood taller than the others. The prisoner had committed no infraction. He simply possessed a physical trait that offended the commandant. Göth drew his pistol and fired. The man collapsed. He lay on the gravel, writhing in his final agony. Göth stepped closer. He unzipped his trousers and urinated on the dying man while the liquid soaked into the victim's clothes. Thousands of prisoners watched in silence. On August 3, 1943, the gallows claimed a 16-year-old boy named Hantok. His crime was singing a Russian song. Beside him, an engineer named Kraut faced the noose for a comment about the camp guards. Göth officially recorded these executions as measures to prevent mutiny among the Ukrainian auxiliaries. It was a formal lie for the Berlin reports. The reality was simpler. Reasons no longer existed. He killed because he had the power to do so. On that day, the prisoners realized that survival was no longer tied to obedience. Death required no justification. Amon Göth's authority over the bodies of his prisoners knew no geographical limits. It followed him from the muddy execution pits of the camp directly into the polished rooms of his private villa. The camp functioned without sanitation. Malnutrition and filth triggered constant waves of intestinal infections. According to medical reports from the period, dysentery and chronic diarrhea killed as many prisoners as the firing squads. To Göth, sickness was a provocation. He once discovered a prisoner who, weakened by infection, had soiled himself. The commander's response was not a bullet, but a ritual of supreme degradation. He forced the man to eat his own excrement. Only after this act was the prisoner granted the mercy of a gunshot. The terror then moved indoors. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig was selected to serve as the commander's personal maid. She was a young Jewish woman thrust into a world of silver cutlery and blood-stained uniforms. On her first day, Göth handed her a shirt. He ordered her to iron it. Helen had never used a heavy professional iron. She struggled with the fabric. Göth watched her in silence. When he saw the uneven creases, he struck her across the face with full force. He leaned in and screamed that the girls in Vienna knew how to iron. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig stood at the window of the commandant's villa. Survival in the house of Amon Göth depended on the clarity of a single pane of glass. She moved the cloth with mechanical precision. Outside, the May sun hit the glass, creating a blinding, incandescent glare. This reflection was her only shield. The commandant viewed his Jewish servants as disposable machinery. Human status did not exist here. Göth once remarked that if a girl was smart enough to clean a window on a sunny day, she was smart enough to work. In the SS bureaucracy, this logic had a darker mirror. They called it Gesundheitsaktion, a health action. In reality, it was a coded signal for industrial liquidation. The date was set for May 7, 1944. The routine of the villa collapsed into the choreography of the camp square. Thousands of prisoners were forced to strip. They stood naked under the white-hot sun. Göth walked the lines alongside the camp doctor. They looked for the slight tremor of a hand or the hollow of a rib cage. Behind them, the SS personnel waited with clipboards. Every name marked was a body destined for the gas chambers. Thousands of naked men and women waited for the doctor to point. In the spring of 1942, Amon Göth established a system of absolute power under the cover of classical music. He would later be arrested by the SS for corruption, but for now, he was the law. How did death sound in Płaszów? It echoed with the waltzes of Johann Strauss. Loudspeakers on the assembly square broadcasted elegant melodies. Romantic ballads and love songs floated over the gravel. Beneath the speakers, banners displayed a cynical promise: for each prisoner, a suitable job. This was the backdrop for the Gesundheitsaktion, the health action. The process was mechanical. Prisoners stripped naked. Thousands of men and women stood exposed under the sun. They marched in a slow, vulnerable line toward a small group of men in gray uniforms. Göth stood at the center. Beside him, the camp doctor. They searched for weakness. A thin frame meant the end. A persistent cough was a death sentence. An elderly woman was pushed to the left. A man with visible ribs followed her. Göth personally intervened to ensure no one unfit remained. He looked at muscles, skin, and eyes. He sought signs of malnutrition that the bureaucracy might miss. The music never stopped. The refined strings of the orchestra played while officers marked skin with ink. This selection lasted for hours. By the end, the elegant waltzes had accompanied the condemnation of 1,400 people. These 1,400 prisoners were loaded onto trains for Auschwitz. Everyone understood the destination. It was not a labor assignment. It was industrial annihilation. The deportation list accounted for 1,400. The 1,400 prisoners departed for Auschwitz. For those remaining, Göth refined the local mechanics of slaughter. He transformed administrative selection into a display of psychological dominance. Medical criteria meant nothing. A momentary impulse decided survival. The camp functioned as a machine. It required space for new arrivals. To clear that space, Göth turned to the limestone quarry. On March 14, 1944, the commandant moved from his balcony to the execution site. He did not just watch, he participated. 300 people stood at the edge of the rocky abyss. They were shot in sequence. 300 bodies fell into the depths in a single afternoon. This figure alone exceeded the daily mortality rate from exhaustion and typhus combined. The methods of killing varied by the commandant's whim. On the parade ground, prisoners faced public gallows. The bodies remained swinging as a permanent warning to the living. In the shadows of the camp, the process became more intimate. The camp crematorium served a dual purpose. Records indicate that 1,100 prisoners were strangled there while hanging from meat hooks. One of them was a child. For more systematic liquidations, Göth designed a specialized execution barn. The architecture of this building served a specific psychological goal. A narrow slit was cut into the wooden wall. The prisoner stood inside, facing the timber. The executioner remained on the other side, invisible and silent. Death arrived as a bullet to the neck from a hidden killer. Amon Göth's presence transformed the physical space of Płaszów into a psychological minefield. Prisoner Poldek Pfefferberg summarized the reality of the camp in 5 words. To see Göth was death. This was not a metaphor. It was a mechanical rule of survival. The commandant's shadow preceded him. He was a massive, heavy figure. When he moved through the camp, his silhouette cast a long, suffocating darkness over the barracks. Prisoners trained their senses to detect him before he appeared. They memorized the specific rhythmic crunch of his boots on the gravel. They learned the exact timbre of his voice. Every nerve ending in the camp tuned itself to one frequency, the proximity of the commander. To remain visible was to invite an execution. The killings often lacked even the pretense of camp discipline. Anna Duklauer-Pearl witnessed this departure from SS regulations. Göth ordered the public hanging of her friend. The crime was not sabotage. It was not an escape attempt. The man died because he had been wealthy before the war. This act violated the official directives of the SS. According to Berlin, punishments required documentation of labor violations or resistance. Göth ignored the bureaucracy of the Reich. He substituted state ideology with a personal, erratic sadism. A prisoner's past economic status became a capital offense. Göth executed the man solely because of his former social standing. Survival in Płaszów lacked a logical foundation. The execution of Anna Duklauer for her former wealth proved that neither obedience nor silence offered protection. Strategy was a myth. Was there a viable way to stay alive? No. The rules shifted like desert sand. The morning formation began at dawn. Amon Göth walked the lines with a rifle or a whip. A prisoner moved too slowly during the roll call. Göth shot him. Moments later, another prisoner hurried to his station. Göth killed him for moving too fast. Speed was irrelevant. Only the whim of the commandant mattered. After the work shift, the barracks fell into a heavy silence. Men sat on wooden planks and stared at the floor. No one spoke of tomorrow. They listened to the wind against the thin walls and the boots of the SS guards outside. To survive until evening was not a victory. It was a statistical anomaly. In Płaszów, Göth dismantled the link between action and consequence. He turned murder into a casual reflex. Under his command, the camp functioned as a laboratory of absolute unpredictability. Thousands of prisoners lived within this mechanical terror every hour of every day. This was the daily reality. The unpredictable terror of the Płaszów camp spilled onto the streets of Krakow on March 13, 1943. Amon Göth did not watch from an office. He stood on the pavement. He held a whip and a semi-automatic pistol. The SS had appointed him to oversee the liquidation of the regional ghettos. Göth accepted the task with deadly enthusiasm. Before the war, Podgórze was a gray industrial zone. In 1941, the Nazi administration drove the Jewish population of Krakow into these few blocks. They built walls. They crowded 16,000 people into an area designed for 3,000. For 2 years, the residents endured starvation and typhus. Yet, they clung to a desperate logic. They believed labor was a shield. If they worked, they lived. Early that morning, the silence broke. Loudspeakers screeched across the squares. Commands echoed off the stone walls. Families began to emerge from their apartments. They carried small suitcases and bundles. Then, Göth appeared. Did the residents understand the shift in their fate? The illusion of safety vanished in seconds. Göth moved through the crowds, personally shooting men, women, and children. He transformed an administrative process into a public execution. This operation would later become the primary charge in his post-war trial. SS units tightened the perimeter around the ghetto. 50 children. Amon Göth shot them personally during a single morning. One man, one pistol, 50 bodies left on the pavement of the Krakow ghetto. When the SS cordoned off the Podgórze district on March 13, 1943, Göth stepped onto the streets holding a whip and a handgun. Loudspeakers screamed orders. Families stumbled out of apartment blocks into the cold air. The liquidation had begun. Göth moved through the crowd like a mechanic inspecting a conveyor belt. He looked for those who lacked labor value. According to Reich doctrine, children under 14 were officially classified as useless eaters. They consumed rations but produced nothing for the war effort. The separation was systematic. Göth tore small children from their parents' arms. He did not hesitate. He did not argue. He simply fired. The scene resembled a factory floor rather than a battlefield. Göth executed the children with mechanical efficiency, clearing what he saw as inconvenient obstacles. The victims were not teenagers who could be mistaken for young adults. They were toddlers and infants. The SS units continued the sorting process as the sun rose higher. Bodies remained where they fell, littering the streets between the residential buildings. For the administration of the Reich, these deaths were a matter of simple arithmetic. The victims possessed zero labor value to the state. While the bodies of 50 children remained on the streets of Krakow, the survivors faced a binary choice. The SS divided the population into two distinct flows. The first group consisted of several thousand Jews deemed fit for labor. These men and women moved toward the Płaszów concentration camp. The second group faced a different logistics chain. The elderly, the sick, and the young filled the freight cars. Documents listed the destination as resettlement in the east. The tracks led directly to the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The scale of the purge transformed the city. Before the invasion, 25,000 Jews lived in Tarnow. They represented nearly 45% of the entire urban population. Years of successive deportations stripped the streets of their inhabitants. During the final evacuation, soldiers executed hundreds more directly on the pavement. By September 1943, the Jewish population of Tarnow had collapsed to 8,000. On the 2nd of September 1943, Amon Göth arrived in Tarnow to finish the liquidation. He brought 200 SS men. The operation began before dawn. The ghetto was a map of two zones. Ghetto A held the workers. Ghetto B held the unemployed. Göth ordered everyone from the first zone into the second. People stood in tight groups according to their workplace. They held wooden signs with the names of their employers. Why was this administrative order established? To simplify the logistics of the coming slaughter. Göth selected 300 people for a specific task. They formed the Sauberungskolonne, the cleaning column. This unit had one purpose: to collect the corpses and scrub the streets once the shooting stopped. The selection followed a mechanical rhythm. The SS divided the survivors again. One line led to heavy labor at Płaszów. The other led to the trains. In the middle of this process, a young Jewish woman stepped out of line. She approached the commandant with a polite request to join her fiancé's work group. A single bullet to the head answered her request. The woman collapsed. No hesitation, no dialogue. Göth holstered his weapon and turned back to the crowd. The selection resumed as if he had merely cleared a minor bureaucratic glitch. Leon Layson watched from the line. Chaos erased the possibility of an exact body count. In the 1946 indictment, witnesses estimated Göth personally executed between 30 and 90 women and children during the Tarnow liquidation. The discrepancy reflects a total collapse of order. Panic and screams filled the loading area. The remaining population became cargo. 10,000 Jews deemed fit for work were forced onto trains headed for Płaszów. Another 4,000 were diverted to Auschwitz. Death began in the cattle cars. Less than half survived the transport. For those who stepped onto the platform alive, the reprieve lasted minutes. They were deemed useless for labor and sent directly to the gas chambers. September 21, 1943. 19 days after the carnage in Tarnow, the liquidation of the Sebny camp began. Amon Göth did not pull the trigger here. He delegated. Command fell to SS Hauptsturmführer Grime. He was a specialist in erasure, a veteran of the Lemberg and Rava Ruska massacres. Under him stood Commander Kellerman. He operated as Göth's direct instrument. The objective: total industrialization of the killing process. Executions moved away from the camp gates. No more chaotic shots in the barracks. 700 people loaded into trucks on the first day alone. The destination was the Dobrukowa forest. 3 kilometers of dense trees provided a natural acoustic barrier. No sound reached the camp. The victims found prepared pits in the soil. Systematic fire, quick burial. This cycle continued until February 1944. As the bodies fell, the looting intensified. Göth did not serve the Reich's treasury, he served himself. SS guards seized furniture, furs, and jewelry from the dead. Kellerman oversaw the confiscation of every scrap of private property. The German state claimed every gold watch and every fur coat. According to SS regulations, the belongings of the murdered belonged to the Reich. Amon Göth saw it differently. He redirected the flow of looted wealth into his own pockets. Confiscated jewelry, tobacco, and alcohol vanished before reaching the state treasury. Göth sold the goods on the black market or shipped them to private storage. Was this a violation of his oath? He proclaimed absolute loyalty to the Reich while systematically robbing its coffers. The scale of this theft remained hidden until later investigations. Gestapo officers eventually discovered massive warehouses in Brunlitz. The rooms were packed with furniture, furs, and high-end goods stolen from the dead. At the center of this stolen empire sat Ruth Irene Calder. Known as Majola, Göth's lover lived in absolute luxury. She was surrounded by the finest silks and mahogany, all financed by the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. Her lifestyle relied on the mechanical extraction of assets from people destined for the gas chambers. Göth's corruption was blatant. He operated within a regime that had bureaucratized genocide, yet his personal greed stood out even to his peers. Even in a system of institutionalized evil, his lack of restraint was considered an anomaly. This level of theft represented an unprecedented case of corruption within the Nazi administrative machine. This chaotic corruption and unpredictable sadism began to alienate even Göth's peers in the SS. The tension was not moral, it was professional. Heinrich Himmler demanded that the SS conduct executions with cold, bureaucratic detachment. He wanted distinguished and disciplined killers. Göth was the opposite. He was impulsive. He was visibly erratic. His cruelty was loud and disorganized. To the high command, he was an embarrassing reminder that their abstract policy was being carried out by men who simply enjoyed the smell of blood. In the ghettos of Krakow and Tarnow, his presence signaled the end of order. There were no protocols during his liquidations, just terror. SS officers watched as Göth turned mass murder into a private performance. Families were torn apart in seconds. Children were ripped from their mothers. The elderly were beaten to death on the pavement because they moved too slowly. Göth moved through the carnage with brutal confidence. He did not look like a bureaucrat. He looked like a predator. With a slight wave of his hand or a casual nod, he decided who lived another hour and who died on the spot. He distributed death with the indifference of a man swatting flies. For the victims, he was no longer a soldier or an official. He was the physical manifestation of their extinction. He became the living embodiment of terror. The SS did not arrest him for the thousands he slaughtered. They arrested him for the coins he stole. On September 13, 1944, Amon Göth was abruptly relieved of his command at Płaszów. This was no routine transfer. It was a formal arrest by his own organization. In the legal framework of the Third Reich, murdering a Jew was technically not a crime. They were non-citizens, stripped of all civil rights and destined for liquidation. His superiors saw the executions as part of his official function. He trained his Great Danes, Rolf and Rolf, to tear living prisoners to pieces. He shot mothers from his balcony for sport. None of this triggered a judicial process. These acts were extreme, but they fell within the twisted logic of the Nazi system. The dissonance between state policy and personal greed became his downfall. The SS investigators arrived to enforce a different kind of order. They ignored the mass graves, but meticulously counted the stolen suitcases. According to Nazi legislation, all Jewish property belonged exclusively to the German state. Göth was charged with the theft of Jewish assets from the Reich. The German legal code did not recognize the murder of a Jew as a crime. However, it viewed the theft of their confiscated belongings as a direct strike against the Reich. Göth had transformed the Płaszów concentration camp into a private enterprise. The mechanism was simple. Every suitcase, every gold tooth, and every winter coat belonged to the state treasury. Göth diverted these goods to the black market. He sold state property for personal profit. The Nazi bureaucracy ignored the piles of corpses but fixated on the missing ledgers. This was a violation of the fundamental principle: the right kills and the right collects. Was there a limit to this institutional hypocrisy? The court accused Göth of failing to feed his prisoners. In reality, the SS designed the camp system to run on starvation. Official rations hovered around 1,000 calories. This was a calculated minimum for slow death. Göth took these meager supplies and sold them to outside buyers. He reduced the calorie count below the level of biological survival. The state did not object to the hunger. It objected to Göth pocketing the proceeds from that hunger. The investigation uncovered total administrative chaos. Before the final charges were filed, Göth allowed unauthorized prisoners and low-ranking guards to access sensitive camp records. He had broken the iron seal of SS secrecy. His violence was equally undisciplined. He administered extreme physical punishments and executions without filing a single bureaucratic report. Judge Georg Conrad Morgan arrived to restore bureaucratic order. The SS leadership viewed Amon Göth's chaotic violence not as a moral failing, but as a breach of operational security. Unauthorized executions and unfiled reports compromised the system. Morgan was the investigator assigned to clean the house. He was a peculiar figure in the SS apparatus, a purist, a man of cold administrative logic. Before arriving in Płaszów, Morgan had already dismantled the career of Karl Koch, the commander of Buchenwald. Koch had been prosecuted for embezzlement and the unauthorized murder of prisoners. According to SS legal archives, corruption among camp commanders was systemic. Morgan was no humanitarian. He believed genocide required discipline. To him, the Holocaust was a state project, not a private criminal enterprise for personal gain. The investigation soon shifted from financial ledgers to the camp's darker corners. Morgan discovered Eleanor Hodes. She was an Austrian political prisoner, a communist held at Auschwitz. Göth had forced her into a sexual relationship. She was pregnant. The commander's response to the pregnancy was a specific form of cruelty. He confined Hodes to a standing cell. It was a narrow stone locker where a human being could only remain upright. No sitting, no kneeling. The prisoner remained there until her release for a specific medical procedure. In 1943, the camp hospital staff performed an abortion. Judge Morgan held a decisive trump card, the 1943 abortion of a female prisoner. In the eyes of the SS, this was not just a medical procedure, it was Rassenschande, racial shame. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 strictly regulated sexual contact. The state equated relations with political prisoners to high treason. Eleonora Hodes was not Jewish. However, her status as a prisoner made any intimacy a criminal violation of racial purity. Morgan interrogated both Hodes and Amon Göth. He documented the testimony. He built the file. The machine stalled. The Soviet Union pressed from the east. Western allies advanced from the west. The Reich was shrinking. Bureaucracy requires stability. War brings chaos. The SS leadership shifted focus from internal corruption to basic survival. Administrative resources vanished into the collapsing front lines. Morgan's investigation hit a wall of disorganized paperwork and burning archives. The legal process did not end with an acquittal. It simply ceased to exist. In the early months of 1945, the SS High Command officially filed away the charges against Amon Göth. In 18 months, this man will calmly adjust the noose around his own neck. But in May 1945, American soldiers found a broken patient in the psychiatric ward of Bad Tolz. How did an absolute dictator of a death camp become a helpless mental patient? Medical records from the SS facility show a total physical and cognitive collapse. Doctors diagnosed Amon Göth with advanced diabetes. Years of excessive alcohol consumption and chronic stress had eroded his internal organs. The diagnosis went deeper than physiology. The SS medical authorities officially declared Göth mentally ill. They noted a severe psychological disorder fueled by years of paranoia and systemic violence. The butcher of Płaszów was no longer fit for service or trial. He was moved to the Bavarian Alps. Bad Tolz served as the location for the elite SS Junkerschule. By placing Göth in a hospital there, the regime signaled the end. The ideological heart of the Black Order was now a sanctuary for its most pathological failures. Outside the hospital walls, the Reich was evaporating. Soviet armies surged through Poland. They liberated the death camps in the east one by one. To the west, British and American divisions crossed the Rhine. Berlin transformed into a meat grinder of urban combat. The map of the thousand-year Reich shrank to the size of a hospital room. The scene in the ward was static. American infantrymen entered the psychiatric wing. They moved past rows of beds. They checked medical charts. The air smelled of sharp hospital antiseptics and stale sweat. In one of the beds sat a man ruined by his own excesses. The soldiers verified the identity. The patient was the former commander of Płaszów. The hunters had found the murderer of thousands in a state of clinical decay. American troops captured the executioner in his hospital bed. The clinical diagnosis offered no sanctuary. The illusion of a medical shield shattered as the Allies declassified the true geography of the Reich. American units entered Dachau and Buchenwald. They found what words could not describe. Stacks of gray corpses reached the ceilings of the warehouses. Skeletal survivors wandered between barracks, eyes vacant, bodies reduced to biological shells. This was not war, it was an industrial process of extinction. Global outrage demanded a target. The world wanted the architects of the vacuum. Poland claimed the prisoner. Płaszów sat on Polish soil. Its soil held the remains of thousands of Polish Jews. The new government in Warsaw, operating under the heavy shadow of Soviet influence, demanded the extradition of those who had turned their land into a graveyard. The Americans did not hesitate. They signed the papers. In July 1946, the transfer began. The journey east was a descent into a cold, mechanical reality. Inside the transport, the steady, rhythmic vibration of the train wheels against the rails served as the only soundtrack. 2 years prior, this man was a god in a field gray uniform. He decided who lived through the morning and who died before lunch. Now he was a psychiatric patient in a locked carriage. The butcher of Płaszów crossed the border as property of the Polish justice system. The SS did not arrest Amon Göth for the murder of thousands. In the summer of 1944, the Reich's own police took him into custody for a different reason. He was stealing from the state. Mass executions in Płaszów were considered a professional duty. Personal enrichment was a capital crime. The Economic and Administrative Main Office, the WVHA, operated with lethal precision. They meticulously tracked the flow of assets seized from the dead. Every gold crown pulled from a victim's jaw, and every hidden wedding ring belonged to the state treasury. Göth, however, treated the camp as his private fiefdom. He redirected carloads of Jewish property to his own black market accounts. The Nazi system maintained a surreal hierarchy of values. Systematic genocide was a legal state policy. The appropriation of a victim's suitcase was a betrayal of the uniform. This bureaucratic pathology meant a commandant could slaughter 10,000 Jews without consequence, provided he handed over their shoes to Berlin. The SS punished the thief, while the butcher remained a hero of the Reich. This massive criminal enterprise operated under the mask of racial purity. The state functioned as a syndicate where fanaticism and common theft were indistinguishable. In the end, the regime ignored the blood on his hands, but obsessed over the marks in his ledger. The official charge sheet ignored the deaths of over 8,000 people. The institutional machine of the SS did not merely tolerate sadism, it weaponized it. For years, the system provided Amon Göth with a legal vacuum where his darkest impulses became state policy. Bureaucrats viewed his brutality as a functional necessity of the concentration camp system. Does a psychiatric diagnosis erase legal responsibility for direct participation in systemic genocide? Doctors noted his deteriorating mental state. He suffered from diabetes and chronic ulcers. Yet madness does not equate to innocence. Thousands of men operated the camps. Most committed atrocities. Göth was different. He sought out the violence. He needed the direct contact with suffering. Day after day, for years, he chose to pull the trigger himself. The rules of the game had changed. The era of SS internal audits and embezzlement charges was over. Göth now faced the Supreme National Tribunal of Poland. In Warsaw, the legal landscape shifted. Just 2 years prior, the Nuremberg Charter had codified a new concept: crimes against humanity. Technicians prepared the courtroom. They tested rows of microphones. Heavy cables snaked across the floor. In the cavernous hall, every footstep sent a hollow echo off the high ceilings. Translators checked their booths. They adjusted headsets for the coming storm of testimony. Göth sat in the dock. He was no longer a god with a rifle. He was a sick man in a faded uniform. He relied on the oldest defense in the manual. He claimed he only followed orders. The trial of the Butcher of Płaszów opened on August 27, 1946. The Supreme National Court of Poland convened in Warsaw on March 11, 1947. The venue was the Polish Teachers' Union building in the Płaszów district. It stood as a rare survivor of the 1944 uprising. Most of the capital lay in ruins. This hall was the only practical choice for a trial of such magnitude. Inside, the atmosphere was dense. 500 people packed the room daily. Many wore thin coats and carried the physical marks of the camps. Technicians installed rows of headphones and wiring for simultaneous translation. A mechanical, rhythmic hum from the translation gear filled the air. Does a psychiatric diagnosis erase legal responsibility for systemic genocide? The court would soon decide. The composition of the gallery was a psychological strike. The audience consisted almost entirely of survivors from Auschwitz and Płaszów. They sat in silence. They adjusted their headsets. They fixed their eyes on the prisoner's dock. 500 survivors. They had watched their families disappear into the gas chambers and pits. Now, they watched the man who gave the orders. For them, the law was no longer an abstraction, it was a physical confrontation. The prosecutor rose to address the Supreme National Court. He began reading 5 specific counts of mass murder and crimes against humanity. The Supreme National Court of Poland focused on 5 specific counts. These points translated chaotic mass murder into cold legal protocols. Prosecutors stood before 500 survivors. They began reading the indictment. The first charge detailed the direct killing of prisoners through beatings, torture, and the use of trained dogs. The second and third counts focused on the liquidation of the Krakow and Tarnow ghettos. In Tarnow, the commandant had moved through the streets personally. He shot residents. He beat them. He watched them die. The fourth charge covered the liquidation of the Sebny labor camp. The fifth stood apart from the blood. It concerned the theft of money and valuables from the victims. Even the SS had noticed this. Gestapo reports on stolen assets became part of the evidence. How does a court quantify a shadow? The prosecution focused on 8,000 documented murders. This was the minimum. The number only included deaths directly linked to his personal orders or actions. It ignored the thousands who perished from exhaustion under his command. It ignored those sent to gas chambers from the ghettos he cleared. The actual death toll exceeded 20,000. Prosecutors presented official logs and administrative records to prove his absolute authority over Płaszów. Every death had a paper trail. The indictment finalized the scope of his personal responsibility. The official charge held him accountable for the deaths of 8,000 Jews. The 8,000 officially recorded deaths formed only the baseline of the prosecution. Beyond the paperwork, the tribunal faced the mechanics of a living nightmare. Prosecutors presented administrative records and Gestapo reports detailing systematic deportations and looted assets. Then, the witnesses arrived. How can a court document the physics of absolute, paralyzing terror? One by one, survivors climbed the stand. They spoke into the microphones while Göth watched from the dock. The courtroom fell into a heavy, metallic silence. Helen Jonas Rosenzweig took the oath. She had served as a maid inside the commandant's villa. She described the view from the balcony and the sound of the rifle. Leon Layson followed. He reconstructed the liquidation of the Tarnow ghetto. He spoke of the selections where Göth's finger determined life or death. Joseph Bau testified next. He did not speak of laws, but of the atmosphere, a constant, unpredictable fear that rotted the mind. The most clinical blow came from Mietek Pemper. As a prisoner clerk in the commandant's office, he had seen the machine from the inside. Pemper stepped to the witness stand. He opened a thin folder of papers. These were not memories, but stolen data. During his service, Pemper had secretly copied confidential Nazi directives and deportation schedules. He reached across the mahogany rail and handed the decrypted records of the SS administration to the tribunal. The testimony of Mietek Pemper and Helen Jonas Rosenzweig froze the tribunal. They did not merely list crimes, they reconstructed the systematic erosion of the human psyche. For 2 years, the world had watched the Nuremberg trials. The public had seen the blueprints of the bureaucratic machinery. But this was different. This was personal. The courtroom fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Witnesses stepped to the mahogany stand. Their hands trembled. Their fingers gripped the wooden edges of the rail until their knuckles turned white. They spoke of a terror that was not industrial, but intimate. The sound of footsteps on gravel. That was the first signal. In Płaszów, the commander's walk functioned as a death sentence. When his shadow appeared in the square, thousands of people physically recoiled. Survival became a game of invisibility. Prisoners developed frantic, desperate strategies to never meet his gaze, to never be noticed, to never exist. The court heard how Göth transformed the camp into a laboratory of madness. Constant uncertainty acted as the primary weapon. No one knew when the next shot would fire from the balcony. Even the most seasoned prosecutors, who believed they were prepared for any horror, sat stunned. The defense remained motionless as the testimony concluded. Judges looked at their notes, then at the man in the dock. No one spoke. The room remained held in a paralyzed collective breath. The defense strategy relied on a single pillar, the chain of command. Defense attorneys argued that the defendant acted strictly under higher orders. The Reich had decreed the final solution as state policy. Heinrich Himmler had issued the specific directives regarding the treatment of Jewish prisoners. According to this logic, the commandant was merely a cog in a massive machine. He was an officer fulfilling a lethal duty. Every execution carried authorization from superiors. As camp commander, he held disciplinary jurisdiction over every soul behind the wire. His lawyers claimed every punishment fell within German regulations of the period. This was the Befehlsnotstand defense. It was the standard shield for every Nazi official facing a gallows. The strategy aimed to dissolve individual bloodlust into the collective guilt of the system. If every hand was forced by an order, then no single hand was guilty. The tribunal dismantled this logic with clinical precision. Article 8 of the Charter of the International Military Tribunal had already set the precedent. Superior orders provided no immunity. The Polish judges were blunt. They declared that no law of war justifies the liquidation of defenseless civilians. A criminal regime cannot authorize a crime. State policy does not absolve the executioner. Laws of war provide no cover for mass murder. The defense of superior orders collapsed against the cold reality of the evidence. Article 8 of the Nuremberg Charter was clear. Obedience to the Reich did not grant immunity for mass murder. Legally, the system provided the frame, but the sub-commandant filled it with blood. The courtroom fell silent as the judge reached for the final documents. There was only the dry rustle of paper. The tribunal rejected any mitigating circumstances. No directive from Berlin mandated the morning ritual of shooting prisoners from a balcony for sport. No official policy required the commander to urinate on the dying. Göth did not just follow the machine. He improved it with a butcher's precision. He ordered victims hung from iron meat hooks. While they swung, he released the dogs. This was not the implementation of a state plan. It was the fulfillment of a private pathological need. He used the Nazi apparatus as a shield for a serial killer's impulses. Göth found in the Reich a perfect laboratory for his own enthusiasm and cruel creativity. Facing documentary evidence of the horrors of Płaszów, the former dictator reacted with absolute provocative indifference. He did not hide behind the veil of offended dignity. He did not deny the existence of the gallows or the pits. Göth accepted full responsibility for every action taken within the camp's perimeter. He admitted to having the authority. He claimed the Reich gave him the mandate for everything he did. His defense rested on a single mechanical pillar: superior orders. This total detachment on trial mirrored psychiatric profiles of severe antisocial personality disorder found in many high-ranking SS officials. Göth expressed no remorse because he felt no guilt. To him, the Jewish prisoners were simply enemies of the state marked for liquidation. He viewed himself as a loyal officer performing a difficult, necessary task. The court saw a man who transformed state policy into a personal bloodbath. His internal logic remained unshaken by the testimonies of those he had hunted with dogs. This chilling confidence in his own righteousness lasted until the final moments of the proceedings. The judges reached their decision on September 5, 1946. The verdict arrived on September 5, 1946. The Supreme National Tribunal of Poland stripped away the rank, the uniform, and the ideology. Amon Göth stood before the judges as a common criminal. The court found him guilty of membership in the Nazi Party. They confirmed he ordered the imprisonment, torture, and extermination of thousands. But the legal core of the trial shifted. In a landmark precedent, the tribunal convicted Göth of homicide. This was not just a war crime or a crime against humanity, it was murder. Why did this distinction matter? The law usually targeted the machine. Here, it targeted the man. By convicting him of homicide, the court bypassed his status as a state official. They focused on the hands that held the rifle. The verdict documented the personal mutilation and torture of an unidentified number of victims. Beyond the administrative genocide of the Reich, Göth was a serial killer. The Chief Justice stood. He looked directly at the prisoner. He pronounced the sentence, death by hanging. The heavy strike of the wooden gavel echoed through the hall. It was the finality of a death warrant. Göth did not flinch. His face remained a mask of total indifference. Other condemned Nazis had collapsed, wept, or pleaded for their lives. Göth watched the proceedings as if they were a routine clerical error. He accepted the announcement of his own execution like a dry administrative report. The mask stayed on. The Krakow Tribunal had finished its work. The Krakow Tribunal concluded its deliberations on a foundation of cold, legal logic. The court dismissed the defense of superior orders as a basis for absolution. International law gained a new, jagged edge. State officials were now personally liable for crimes committed under the color of authority. The verdict drew a sharp line between bureaucratic participation and individual, sadistic violence. This was not a trial of a soldier. It was the prosecution of a murderer. In the gallery, hundreds of survivors sat in a heavy collective silence. When the words death penalty echoed through the chamber, the room didn't erupt. Instead, a singular, massive exhale rippled through the rows of those who had outlived the Płaszów camp. For them, no sentence could repair the trauma or restore the lost. Yet, seeing Amon Göth officially branded a criminal carried a profound symbolic weight. The predator was now the prey of the law. Justice had been codified, but the physical culmination remained. The Krakow Tribunal sentenced Göth to death by hanging. The execution date loomed. The gallows required precise preparation for the man who had dispensed terror for years. This would not be a clean, swift end. The mechanical reality of the execution involved 3 separate attempts with the rope before the drop finally held. The guards began the final transfer to the courtyard of Montelupich prison. The Polish authorities scheduled the execution for September 13, 1946. The location carried a heavy symbolic weight. Montelupich prison in Krakow. This facility sat only a few miles from the Płaszów concentration camp. The proximity ensured a final, grim symmetry. The man who had terrorized the hills of Płaszów would draw his last breath in their shadow. Justice required a different form than before. In the summer of 1946, the public hanging of Gauleiter Arthur Greiser in Poznan had spiraled into a chaotic carnival. Nearly 100,000 people attended. Families brought children to watch the drop. Vendors moved through the masses. They sold ice cream, soft drinks, and sweets to the spectators. After the trap door opened, the crowd surged forward. People fought each other for scraps of the hangman's rope to keep as macabre souvenirs. The Ministry of Justice faced a wave of condemnation. Prominent intellectuals in the Catholic Church filed formal protest against the spectacle. They argued that such displays degraded the law into a morbid attraction. To preserve the dignity of the verdict, the authorities moved the gallows behind the high stone walls of the prison. The church and the academic elite remained firm in their opposition to turning state-sanctioned death into a public theater. 100 official witnesses. A strict limit imposed by the Ministry of Justice to prevent a repeat of the public spectacle in Poznan. Only those with special passes could cross the perimeter. German prisoners of war arrived at the site at dawn. Guards watched from the towers. The prisoners hauled heavy timber across the yard of Montelupich prison. During the occupation, the Gestapo used these same cells to break Polish resistance fighters. Now, German soldiers were building a gallows for an SS officer. The air smelled of freshly sawn wood. Saws tore through planks. Hammers drove nails into the frame. The platform rose steadily, piece by piece. Prisoners tested the trapdoor mechanism under the cold gaze of armed sentries. Some reports suggest these same prisoners were forced to act as executioners, though the official records remain silent. The courtyard became a fortress. Guards in steel helmets stood at every entrance. The guest list was a cross-section of the new order: prosecutors, ministry officials, representatives of the state prosecutor's office. Most notably, the survivors of Płaszów stood among the crowd to watch their tormentor fall. The high stone walls muffled the sound of the city outside. Inside, the state machine moved with cold, bureaucratic precision. Security was absolute. No cameras, no crowds, no vendors, just the gallows and the law. The transport arrived at exactly 8 in the morning. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the guards transferred the prisoner to the former administrative building of the Montelupich prison. He did not scream. He did not struggle. Instead, the man who once hunted prisoners from his balcony made a single, mundane request. He asked for a cup of coffee. The authorities granted it. Amon Göth sat in silence, lifting the porcelain to his lips. Witnesses noted the rhythmic, quiet clink of the coffee cup against the saucer. It was the steady hand of a man untroubled by his own history. He drank slowly, savoring a final moment of normalcy before the state revoked his right to breathe. The bureaucracy of death moved to the next stage. Guards escorted him to the camp jail in Block 11, the infamous death block. He waited there for exactly 2 hours. At 10 o'clock sharp, the heavy cell door swung open. Göth stepped out into the light. Father Tadeusz Zaremba, a priest from Silesia, stood waiting. It was a calculated mercy for a man who had shown none. Göth did not falter. His hands were bound behind his back, forcing his shoulders back and his chest forward. He marched down the main street of the camp with a rhythmic, energetic stride. Some observers called it a swagger. He moved toward the timber structure with his chin tilted upward and a look of absolute composure. In 1946, the former commandant of Płaszów walked toward the wooden gallows. Father Tadeusz Zaremba, a priest from the town of Oświęcim, waited for him. This was the man who had denied thousands their right to a final prayer. Now, he sought religious consolation for himself. The witnesses stood in a tight semicircle. Some were survivors of his camp. They remembered the rifle fire from the balcony. Others had lost their entire families in the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. They watched the man they once called a god climb the steps. His hands were cuffed behind his back. The executioners had to lift him onto a wooden stool. The stool stood directly over the trap door. Geometrically, a hanging is a calculation of mass and gravity. According to the standard drop tables, the length of the rope must match the prisoner's weight to ensure the neck snaps instantly. If the cord is too long, it decapitates. If it is too short, the prisoner strangles for several minutes. The math must be perfect. The priest began the final prayers. The executioner stepped forward with the noose. It was a thick, coarse rope. Göth did not flinch as the hemp touched his skin. Instead, he tilted his chin. With a slow, deliberate movement of his head, he adjusted the position of the rope around his neck. It was a gesture of absolute composure. Even on the threshold of death, he refused to let another man dictate how the coil sat against his throat. The executioner kicked the stool away. A loud, dry crack of splintering wood echoed through the courtyard as the trap door swung open. The heavy body of Amon Göth vanished into the dark square of the hatch. In 1993, this man would become the global face of absolute evil on cinema screens. But on a September morning in 1946, he was merely a suffocating body. The executioner had failed to calculate the correct length of the rope. The mechanics of a judicial hanging are precise. According to the British execution tables of the period, a prisoner required exactly 1,000 foot-pounds of force to ensure the instant fracture of the cervical vertebrae. If the drop is too short, the prisoner dies of slow strangulation. If the rope is too long, the body strikes the floor. Amon Göth stood on the wooden trapdoor. The hatch snapped open. His heavy frame vanished into the square opening. Instead of the sharp crack of a breaking neck, the witnesses heard a dull, sickening thud. The rope was too long. Göth hit the ground, his spine intact, his lungs gasping for air. The guards hauled the gasping commander back up to the platform. He was shivering. The executioner adjusted the hemp. The second drop followed. Again, the calculation failed. Again, the body struck the boards without the finality of death. Between the first and second attempts, the rope measured several inches beyond the required drop. This minor mathematical error transformed an execution into a physical struggle. Göth was hoisted for the second time. He had now survived 2 failed drops. He stood on the edge of the hatch, his face bruised and his breath ragged. Only on the third attempt did the trapdoor finally deliver the intended result. Amon Göth remained suspended in the dark void of the gallows. The heart of Amon Göth stopped at 10:21 in the morning. This followed 13 minutes of physical agony and 3 separate falls from the wooden platform. The struggle ended. The executioner finally found the correct length of the rope. Father Zara recited the prayer for the dying as the body hung motionless. At 10:18, the doctor began the final examination. 3 minutes later, the official pronouncement followed. How does a system erase the memory of a hangman? The state scatters his ashes over the Vistula River, preventing any possibility of a shrine. The remains left the prison for a crematorium. Records of the exact location remain vague, a deliberate move by the Polish authorities. Absolute power ended in total physical dissolution. The Vistula stretches for over 1,000 kilometers. This geography guaranteed the remains would wash into the Baltic Sea. There was no room for a grave. There was no space for a monument. The Polish press treated the event as a minor bureaucratic detail. Brief notes appeared in the back pages. The man who built a kingdom of terror vanished into the water. No trace remained. No physical mark of his existence survived the current. Officials disposed of the ashes in the Vistula. After the current swept the last physical traces of Amon Göth into the Vistula, the Polish state moved to erase him from the visual record. Justice required a witness, but the government feared a spectacle. The press received strict orders. No eyewitness accounts. No sensationalism. Only a brief, cold notice of the execution appeared in the newspapers. How does a state bury the image of a monster? They lock it in a vault. Stanislaw Danczek stood on the platform that morning. He was the only photographer present. He captured the final moments of the butcher of Płaszów. Immediately after, the Ministry of Justice seized his work. The heavy steel door of a government safe clicked shut. The negatives vanished into the depths of the communist bureaucracy. Decades passed. At some point, the original film disappeared entirely. Today, only 11 physical prints remain. While the state censored the images, the truth reached Göth's inner circle with lethal force. Suicide among the wives of high-ranking SS officers remained a statistical rarity. Most chose flight, denial, or the anonymity of post-war chaos. Göth's wife chose a different path. She learned the full magnitude of his crimes. She realized her life had been a domestic facade for a mass murderer. The psychological weight proved fatal. She took her own life shortly after the revelation. The 11 surviving photographs remained hidden in the Ministry of Justice until the final years of the Polish People's Republic. In 2002, Monika Hertwig published her memoirs. Amon Göth's daughter faced a fracture in reality. On one side was the idealized father described by her mother. On the other was the butcher of Płaszów. She spent years trying to bridge the gap between a ghost and a monster. Did the triple failure of the rope signify a hidden agenda? The question remains. Some suggest intentional sabotage by the Polish executioner. However, historical data points elsewhere. No evidence of a plot exists. The truth is more mechanical. Execution by hanging is a matter of physics. It requires a precise ratio of the condemned man's weight to the length of the drop. The rope must snap the neck instantly. If the calculation fails, the body becomes a dead weight. In 1946, the executioner was likely nervous. The gravity of the moment interfered with the math. He misjudged the force of the impact. Fibers groaned under Göth's bulk but refused to snap. The man who had industrialized murder was now a victim of basic technical incompetence. The myth of the terrifying commandant dissolved into a clumsy farce. For years, he had treated death as casual sport. Now, death refused to take him quickly. He lost all control over the situation. Amon Göth sought the same mercy he had spent years systematically erasing. He requested a priest. He drank a final cup of coffee. The man who had once decided life and death with a casual flick of a finger now obsessively adjusted the rope around his own neck. 37 years. This was the median age for SS commanders who hit their peak during the war. They were a generation of rapid promotions fueled by mass murder. Göth was no exception. He reached the height of his power before most men reach middle age. He stood on the gallows as a fading shadow, yet the wake of his violence spanned continents. Thousands carried his scars, thousands more were ash. He had liquidated entire communities with the stroke of a pen and a rifle across his shoulder. By the 1970s, this specific brand of sadism would almost vanish from the public consciousness. He would become just another name in a dusty archive. The world would move on, burying the individual monster under the weight of general statistics. But in those final seconds, the scale was personal. The absolute control he exercised over Płaszów did not follow him to the scaffold. He died at the age of 37. Amon Göth exited the physical world in 1946, but his name soon followed him into the shadows. While the high command of the Third Reich remained etched in global infamy, the commandant of Płaszów dissolved into the gray background of history. He became a footnote, a monster lost among thousands of other monsters. How does a mass murderer vanish from collective memory? In the decades following the war, the public focused on the architects, not the foremen. Names like Hitler, Himmler, and Göring dominated the headlines. The Nuremberg trials provided a face for the catastrophe. To the world, the Holocaust was a machine directed from Berlin. The men who pulled the triggers in the provinces were mere cogs. The 1960s brought a shift in focus. In 1961, Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. His trial in Jerusalem became a global phenomenon. Families gathered around wooden radio sets and grainy black and white televisions. They watched the man in the glass booth. The static of the broadcast carried the weight of 6 million deaths. While the cameras tracked Eichmann's every twitch in Jerusalem, the file on Amon Göth gathered dust in the archives. No one spoke his name in the salons of Europe or the suburbs of America. The scale of the genocide worked in Göth's favor. Individual cruelty was swallowed by statistical enormity. Specialized historians documented his crimes, and survivors carried the scars of his rifle fire, but the general public looked elsewhere. By the 1970s, Amon Göth had achieved the one thing he never allowed his victims: a quiet, undisturbed oblivion. The silence around the name ended in 1980. Thomas Keneally, an Australian author, walked into a leather goods store in Beverly Hills. He was looking for a briefcase. He found a witness. Inside the shop stood Leopold Pfefferberg. He was one of the 1,200 Jews saved by Oskar Schindler. Why did Schindler's story require the presence of Göth? The evolution of a savior gains meaning only against the backdrop of absolute sadism. For decades, Pfefferberg had searched for a writer to document the survival of the Schindler Juden. He convinced Keneally to listen. Keneally began his research. In 1982, he published Schindler's Ark. The book achieved a rare feat for documentary prose. It won the Booker Prize. The narrative structure demanded a monster. To understand Schindler's humanity, the world had to see the alternative. That alternative had a face and a name: Amon Göth. The geography of the Holocaust provided the collision point. Schindler's enamelware factory sat adjacent to the Płaszów concentration camp. Survival depended on a deadly social dance. Schindler entered the commandant's villa. He brought cognac. He brought luxury goods. He used bribes and flattery to buy the lives of his workers from the man who saw them only as targets. 10 years separated the pages of the Booker Prize-winning novel from the cinematic flashpoint that changed history. Literary success for Thomas Keneally's Schindler's Ark remained a local triumph until 1993. That year, Steven Spielberg brought a film crew to the frozen grounds of the former Płaszów camp. The most commercially successful director in Hollywood had hesitated for years. He doubted his own ability to handle the gravity of the Holocaust. Then, the silence broke. Spielberg chose a stark, monochrome aesthetic. Black and white film captured the biting Polish winter. The camera moved through the real geography of the terror. This was not a studio set, it was a site of execution. The financial gamble was immense. Spielberg operated with a budget of $22 million. A black and white historical drama was a massive risk for any studio. Yet the film shattered expectations. It grossed over $320 million worldwide. The global audience proved it was ready to witness the mechanics of the genocide. For the role of the commandant, Spielberg avoided established stars. He needed a face that had not yet been associated with heroism or romance. He chose Ralph Fiennes, a relatively unknown British actor. Ralph Fiennes transformed a dry historical record into a terrifyingly lucid embodiment of the banality of evil. The transformation began with the physical frame. To match the commandant's imposing silhouette, the actor gained 28 pounds. He achieved this through a specific, repetitive regimen of drinking Guinness Stout. This was not merely about size. It was about replicating the heavy, sluggish presence of a man fueled by alcohol and absolute power. The iconic sequence on the villa balcony serves as the film's psychological anchor. Fiennes stands shirtless in the morning light. He holds a Steyr Mannlicher rifle. He aims at the moving shapes in the camp below with the casual indifference of a man swatting flies. The dry crack of the rifle shot echoes off the stone walls. Downstairs, Helen Hirsch listens to the rhythmic percussion of the executions. It was not the violence itself that chilled the survivors, but the lack of transition. Göth could pivot from a lethal shot to an ordinary conversation without changing his tone. The violence often followed a disturbing domestic pattern. Fiennes portrayed the moments of explosive rage as a release for Göth's internal contradictions. In one scene, a drunken confession of attraction toward Helen Hirsch ends in a brutal beating. The ideology of racial purity collided with raw sexual exploitation. Göth could not reconcile his desire with his doctrine. He chose to erase the evidence of his humanity through physical trauma. His monstrosity was not a constant scream, but a series of sudden, jagged breaks in a mask of normalcy. He would beat a woman to the floor and then adjust his collar. This performance effectively visualized the ideological madness of the third solution. Mila Pfefferberg, a survivor of the Płaszów concentration camp, visited the set 50 years after the liberation. She encountered Ralph Fiennes in full SS regalia. Her mind recognized the British actor. Her body did not. The elderly woman began to shake with uncontrollable physical tremors. This visceral reaction bridged half a century of trauma in a single second. It was the ultimate testament to the terrifying accuracy of the performance. Fiennes had recreated the monster so faithfully that the past literally surged into the present. The portrayal earned universal acclaim and a BAFTA award for Best Supporting Actor. The American Film Institute solidified this legacy. They ranked Fiennes's Amon Göth 15th on their list of the 50 greatest cinema villains. This made Göth the highest-ranking character on the list based on a real person. 7 Academy Awards. The film swept the Oscars, transforming a black-and-white reel into a global educational standard. It achieved what decades of textbooks could not. Tens of millions watched. The Holocaust became emotionally immediate. Yet the physical reality of the crime followed a different trajectory. In 1944, the SS began the liquidation. They had a directive: erase the evidence. While sites like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald were preserved as museums with guides and markers, Płaszów faced systematic dissolution. Auschwitz receives over 2 million visitors annually. It is a fortress of memory. Płaszów remained devoid. For decades, the site where Göth reigned was nothing more than an unmarked wasteland. Nature took over. Heavy gray stone ruins sat silent under the weeds. Wild grass now grows over the foundations of the barracks. Thorns cover the execution pits. The earth simply absorbed the scars of 1944. Vegetation continues to swallow the remaining ruins. By the 1990s, the site of the Płaszów camp had devolved into a nameless wasteland, surrounded by modern high-rise developments. Post-war urbanization began to physically consume the perimeter of the former terror zone. The transformation followed a deliberate erasure. Before the final evacuation in 1944, the SS dismantled the barracks. They tore down the electrified barbed wire. They scrubbed the earth to hide the evidence of Göth's crimes. For decades, the Polish state left the soil unmarked. No plaques, no maps, no explanatory photographs. Nature filled the vacuum. The geography of mass murder became a local anomaly. Modern apartment blocks now stand where the administrative offices once operated. Residents look out of their windows at a generic green space. Children play where the subcamps stood. The city effectively digested the killing fields, reclassifying the site as a standard municipal park. While the campgrounds turned into a silent park, the family legacy of Amon Göth began to fracture from within. His daughter, Monika Hertwig, was born in 1945. She arrived just months after her father's arrest. For decades, she lived inside a carefully constructed lie. Her mother, Ruth Calder, painted a portrait of a patriotic officer and a devoted father. To Ruth, Göth was a victim of post-war persecution. The narrative was a total fiction. Monika grew up believing in a hero who never existed. The mother spoke of a gentleman. The archive spoke of a butcher. This realization triggered a total psychological collapse. In 2002, Monika broke the silence of the second generation. She published her memoirs under a haunting title, I Must Love My Father, Mustn't I? The book hit the shelves during a massive wave of German descendant literature. It was a public dissection of filial guilt. Monika had to accept a brutal reality. Her very existence was the byproduct of a monster's peak power. The most intense confrontation happened off the page. Monika sought out Helen Jonas Rosenzweig. Helen had been Göth's housemaid. She was a slave who saw the commandant's most intimate, sadistic moments. They met under the cold eye of a film camera. The air between them was heavy, thick with decades of unuttered trauma. Monica sat across from the woman her father had terrorized. She was looking for atonement. She was looking for a way to breathe. Helen did not offer absolution for the dead, but she looked at the daughter. In a final act of humanity, Helen Jonas Rosenzweig expressed compassion for the child of her tormentor. The meeting between Monica and Helen transcends a mere family reckoning. It forces academic scholarship to reclassify the very nature of such cruelty. Historians move beyond the personal drama to categorize the architects of the Holocaust. The classification of evil follows a distinct hierarchy of participation. Adolf Eichmann represents the first tier. He was the desk murderer, a bureaucrat who managed logistics, train schedules, and quotas from a sterile office. For Eichmann, genocide was a matter of administrative efficiency. He rarely saw the blood he spilled. Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, occupied the second tier. He was the career administrator. Höss oversaw the industrialization of death on a scale previously unknown to history. Yet, he maintained a calculated distance from the mechanics of the killing. He functioned as a manager of a factory, viewing mass murder as a technical problem to be solved. Amon Göth belongs to a separate, darker category. He was the active sadist. Göth required more than the silent submission of his victims. He demanded the visual testimony of their agony. From the balcony of his villa, he hunted prisoners with a sniper rifle. He did not kill to fulfill a quota. He killed to witness the physical collapse of a human being. The system gave him the authority to delegate, but Göth chose the weight of the pistol in his own hand. This distinction separates the functional killers from the pathological ones. In the academic typologies of the Third Reich, Göth is defined by his need for physical contact with the act of murder. The Nazi state provided the structure, but Göth provided the personal bloodlust. Within the institutional framework of the SS, he remains the primary example of the individual who maximized personal violence. He stands as the definitive model of the proactive executioner. The Nazi system provided Adolf Eichmann with a sterile office and a telephone. It gave Amon Göth the entire Płaszów labor camp. This was not merely a cog in a machine. This was a personal theater of torture. The bureaucratic apparatus of the Holocaust functioned on distance. High-ranking officials in Berlin signed papers and managed logistics from hundreds of miles away. They specialized in the banality of evil. Göth rejected this distance. He sought the physical sensation of the kill. He turned genocide into a private, sadistic ritual. According to SS personnel records, over 8,000 officers served in the concentration camp system. Many delegated the violence. They remained in their quarters while subordinates carried out the executions. Göth did the opposite. He maximized his presence during the liquidation of the Krakow ghetto. He personally patrolled the camp perimeters with a sniper rifle. Why did he choose this? The system allowed for administrative detachment, yet Göth demanded tactile cruelty. He could have stayed in his villa in Vienna. He could have managed Płaszów from behind a mahogany desk. Instead, he chose to walk the execution pits, ensuring he was the last thing his victims saw. He intentionally bypassed every opportunity to delegate the slaughter. The trajectory began in a Viennese bookstore and terminated on a wooden scaffold in Krakow. Between these points lay the transformation of a man into a monster. Amon Göth did not merely follow orders, he optimized them for maximum agony. The Nazi system provided the office, but Göth built the theater. He traded his SS uniform for a prison smock. The authority vanished. Only the physical reality of the noose remained. Faced with the end, the butcher of Płaszów sought spiritual consolation. He reached for the comfort he had denied thousands. It was a desperate human reflex. But the mechanics of death proved as stubborn as his own cruelty. The executioner kicked the chair. The rope held, but the drop failed. The trapdoor opened again. Another failure. It took 3 attempts to end his life. This was not divine intervention. It was a calculation error in the physics of the gallows. Of the 8,000 SS personnel stationed at concentration camps, only a fraction faced a courtroom. Most faded into the quiet of post-war civilian life. Göth was the exception. His death served as a delayed, imperfect answer to a career of slaughter. He left behind a legacy of ash and a body count that remains a scar on history. He was responsible for the deaths of more than 10,000 prisoners.